Let me make sure I am doing it now. Thank you for
There
reminding
we
me.
go. Okay, just didn't want to miss out on that if that was part of the plan.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So, my goal in the short time that we have together tonight is to provide an introduction, what I'm calling MTSS 101, to a school change model called multi-tiered systems of support. And this model is about getting the systems in our schools set up in a way that will support academic, behavior, and social emotional outcomes for all students. I'm just going to focus on the part of the academic component of MTSS around reading and literacy. And I want to start by framing this conversation within the definition of the science of reading. And hopefully you all are familiar with this definition. You're using this definition. You can access it from the Reading League's website. And the part of the definition of the science of reading that I want to highlight is what's in purple here, that the research evidence is clear on many topics. We don't have answers in research on everything that we might be concerned about related to literacy, but we have a lot of evidence that we can bring to bear in the work that we're doing in schools to be more effective for students. And we really need to be focused on making sure that the steps that we take in schools are grounded in that evidence base, because we know a great deal about what can improve reading and writing outcomes for all students. So that's what we need to be focused on and elevating. You might not be familiar with the part of the definition of the science of reading that is about multi-tiered systems of support. So as the defining guide states, MTSS is the framework for delivering what's in the reading research. It's the way of contextualizing what is in the reading research for the specific needs of your community, your families, your students, and your educators. It is the mechanism through which we bring together what's known in the research with the particulars of your school environment. One of the most impactful findings in the reading research for me is the fact that we can prevent almost all reading difficulties. And the reading difficulties that we can't prevent, we can minimize the impact of those difficulties or even reading disabilities with what we do in school, primarily through early screening and early intervention and instruction. We know that once students are struggling readers, it may take very intensive, very specialized, very targeted and individualized instruction to get students to catch up. And we also know a great deal about how to get just about every student on track by the end of first grade. What it takes to remediate a reading problem, it can be very difficult versus what it takes to prevent the reading problem, which can happen with much fewer resources, much less intensity of resources, and is much more effective, much more likely to actually happen if we focus on prevention. So we know a great deal about what to teach in kindergarten and first grade, how to teach it, and how to organize our schools as systems to make sure that everybody is lined up to get those good outcomes for students by the end of first grade. And I don't want to leave anyone thinking that if you have struggling readers, perhaps your own children beyond first grade who are having reading difficulties, that it's not possible for them to catch up. But I do want to be clear that the evidence suggests that it is very difficult to catch students up. The amount of time, the amount of individualized resources that are required is quite intense. So we have to keep that in mind. This is really what the multi-tiered systems of support framework was organized around, that we want to find students as early as possible, get them the support that they need as early as possible, and do what we can to prevent and minimize reading difficulties with as many students as we possibly can, so that we can free up the resources that are necessary for students who do have reading difficulties and disabilities like dyslexia. So MTSS is first and foremost a prevention model. It originated in public health. So you can think about a parallel in public health. 3 tiers of prevention of reading failure is the original concept behind this. Just like we have universal health promotion or prevention of the flu, something common like the flu, those are the things that we do with everyone that are sort of low cost, easy to implement, that will have a big impact on a large number of people. Things like washing your hands frequently, not letting people sneeze on you, eating healthy and getting rest, right? Those are like primary prevention of the flu. That was translated into reading because of this research showing that we actually can prevent reading failure for the vast majority of students. So this image, this triangle image, or what I'm trying to display as a 3-dimensional cone, and I'll talk about that in just a minute, comes from this idea of using what we know to be primary prevention of reading failure, the high quality, differentiated, research aligned instruction that we apply to all students universally. Doesn't mean the same thing, more on that in a minute, but everybody accesses this system of primary prevention. And I have these horizontal arrows within each of these tiers of instructional support to represent that we're supporting all students, high performing, low performing, everybody in between. I also am trying to represent, as you go from tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 3, the intensity of resources that increase. And the fact that this model is about organizing resources and systems so that you don't have to give intensive support unless that is exactly what's needed. So why do an MRI when just a simple blood test would give you the answer that you need, is kind of an analogy to think about. If we could get the result that we need with students with a less intensive support or service, that's what we should be applying first. And the numbers out to the left-hand side of this model are often confused, but what this relates to is the system of universal screening that we had when this model was first created. It was called DIBBLS, most recently DIBBLS Next, and it's now, that test is now called Acadience Reading. It was the only universal screening tool that was available when this model was first sort of put into place. And the Acadience benchmark goals are designed so that they are the lowest acceptable score, the lowest score today that puts the odds in the student's favor of being an okay reader in the future. So every student should score at those Acadience benchmark goals. 100% of students should score that way. So these percentages total to 100. And it represents the fact that everyone can reach those grade level expectations, but not in the same way, not with the same kind or amount of instruction. We need to use our first reading instruction, classroom reading instruction, tier 1, to get the vast majority of students on track. So something like 80%. But then it's recognized that some students are going to need an extra dose of prevention or intervention. We call that tier 2 instruction, not instead of tier 1, but in addition to get another 15% of students to those expectations. And then tier 3, or very individualized and intensive support, to get the last 5% of students to those benchmark goals. So the idea is that in order to have very intensive supports, the kind of instruction that students with disabilities like dyslexia need and deserve, we can't have very many students who need that kind of intensive support. So in order to make those resources available to students who need them, we have to minimize risk through the first way that we teach reading in Tier 1. So those are some general concepts about the tiered model. Now, I want to just do a very quick history lesson because I think sometimes we lose track of where did this model come from? What is this all about? And there were some ways of doing business in schools back in the 1980s that were not serving students well. And so here are some of the things that were going on then that you might recognize still in your schools today. So here are the underlying assumptions to kick us off. All students can learn. If the student hasn't learned it, you haven't taught it the right way for them to learn it. It's the responsibility of the adult in the environment to find a way to teach the student effectively. Students are learning in schools which are complex host environments. This is Ed Kameanui's phrase that helps us remember we can't just take the science of reading off the shelf and expect it to work in every school district in the same way, or even with every child in the same way. So this is why you'll see database decision-making becomes so important. Decision-making is shared throughout the school community. That includes parents, family members, other community members. And instruction in the MTSS model is grounded by research. Where we have evidence and where evidence is lacking, we're grounded in solid, strong theory. This means that we are focused on outcomes over our beliefs or preferences or ideology. Now, these are all challenging things to accomplish, and we can talk about how to get there. Okay, so here are the aspects of what I call the traditional model of service delivery. MTSS is first and foremost a systems change framework. It is a school improvement framework. It is not about just moving students through a series of interventions. It is certainly not about delaying intervention for students. It is not an alternate route to special education. Here are some of the problems that we used to experience. We used to have to wait for a teacher to recognize that there was difficulty. A student was having a difficulty with reading. And then that teacher would have to refer to some kind of school support team, or we called it an intervention assistance team. And there were never enough resources to go around in this approach. So the MTSS model was a deliberate alternative to that, focused on prevention. And through the magic of universal screening, we no longer have to wait for individual teachers to recognize that a student is having difficulty. We know 3 times a year when we're testing all students with screening, we know exactly which students are on track and which students are likely to need more support. We can use grade level teams to engineer the right kind of instruction in the regular classroom first and foremost in response to that universal screening. And then we can put in place this tiered system of instruction and intervention. In the old way of doing business, we had very separate special education and general education systems. One of the hallmarks of MTSS is the integration of all service delivery, all instructional support systems for the benefit of students. So bringing together special education, EL services, speech therapy, remedial education, Title I services, and so on, all integrated and driven towards student outcomes. We used to make decisions, especially decisions about special education eligibility, in an expert model and with a discrepancy formula. And now we can make decisions about students, including eligibility for special education, with direct assessment in the collaborative problem-solving model. So not making decisions that are disconnected from classroom performance, not making decisions, high-stakes decisions based on performance on a single test on a single day, or the difference between IQ and achievement, but making decisions, especially about disabilities like dyslexia, with data on students over time, across time. So getting a consistent picture of student performance in response to different kinds of instruction until we find the instruction that works. And we used to just, at best, inform parents of what was happening in schools, get their permission at certain points in time. And in the MTSS model, parents are true collaborators and members on teams at all levels. And I'll talk about those teams in just a minute. So this is really about shifting away from the old way of doing business to operating differently in schools. The structures and systems that make these things possible are what I'm trying to depict at the base of this cone, the gray oval there, listing tiered instruction, a system of support, or I'm sorry, a system of assessments, teaming leadership, and that database decision-making collaborative problem-solving model, professional learning, which includes coaching. So I'm just going to briefly describe each of those elements. So I want you to think about your current school or the school where you send your children. You know what the barriers are. You know what the strengths are. You know what things, if you had a magic wand to wave over the school, what things you would change. You have a pretty good sense of what things are working well, where they could make improvements. Those are exactly the things that need to be brought forward, listed, prioritized, and put into the problem-solving process so that action plans can be created to make the changes for better outcomes for students. That's what happens in MTSS. So in terms of building this tiered model of prevention, I want to start with describing what people call core reading instruction, tier 1 instruction, what I call primary prevention of reading failure. This is classroom reading instruction. This is where students spend most of their reading instructional minutes, and the goal should be to get most students to reach grade level expectations, to minimize risk through the first way that we teach reading. No intervention. The way we teach reading to everybody the first time should be so powerful and lined up to their needs that it causes something like 80% of the students to reach grade level expectations. This is the job of classroom reading instruction. So one thing that we need to consider in designing classroom reading instruction is having adequate time for that instruction to take place. Something like 90 to 120 minutes. The number of minutes that you need for tier 1 instruction depends on the needs of your students. It depends on how many students are at risk when you do screening. You might only need 45 minutes for an ELA block each day. You might need 150 minutes. This is a data-based decision. It depends on the needs of your students. It might look different school to school. It might look different grade to grade. It should depend on your screening data. What you do during those minutes is really, really important. In fact, what happens within the regular classroom setting is the most important variable in terms of student reading outcomes. And we know a lot in the research that we can rely on in terms of what to teach and how to teach it, what routines and materials to use. And we should be focusing instruction on those practices that we have evidence to suggest that they are effective. One of the things that people misunderstand about tier 1 or classroom reading instruction, when we say everybody gets it, some people think that means everybody gets the same thing. And in fact, that is not the way MTSS is designed. Tier 1 instruction, classroom reading instruction, should be highly differentiated. The reason to do universal screening is to find out what your Tier 1 should look like. You should base the design and construction of classroom reading instruction you should base it on what your students need. So this means your team at the grade level is going to have to make decisions about what to teach in whole group, what to teach in small group, how to group students for that instruction, what instructional routines and materials to use, and so on. I mentioned that grade level team because that is the group that gets together to plan what instruction should look like in Tier 1 at each grade level. The grade level team includes every classroom teacher, special educators who are supporting that grade, other related service folks, EL staff, SLPs, school psychologists, a building administrator. If you have coaches or other district level personnel, they can serve on grade level teams. There are even schools that have parent and community members who serve as representatives on grade level teams to help inform the perspective, the culture, the language perhaps of the families in the community, and to bring that perspective to this classroom reading instruction planning. You'll know if you have effective classroom reading instruction if the majority of your students are reaching those minimum benchmark goal expectations just through Tier 1. No intervention, Tier 1 instruction alone. This is where true changes in literacy outcomes starts. This is the piece that's most important. It's not about intervention. It's not about moving students between tiers. It's about matching the first way we teach reading to the needs of the students that have been identified through universal screening. Even with very high quality and effective Tier 1 instruction, some students will need more in order to reach those same grade level expectations. So the purpose of Tier 2, or what we might call strategic reading instruction or secondary prevention of reading failure, is to catch up the students who are at risk. This is an extra instructional dose at another time of day outside of the ELA block or the Tier 1 reading instruction. Students who are at risk, students who are already behind, can reach the same grade level expectations, but they will need more instructional minutes to do so. They will need more strategic instruction, more individualized instruction, more explicit and systematic instruction. So it's not going to happen with the same number of minutes. Some people misunderstand this, and they think that students should come out of Tier 1 to get their reading intervention. And if that's the case, those students who are struggling are only getting the same number of minutes as everybody else is getting. And that's really not going to be sufficient. So this is an extra dose of instruction. It should be very closely aligned, if not exactly the same instruction that students are getting in Tier 1 in that small group format. So if we have differentiated Tier 1 so that we're matching the instruction to what students need, we should provide that same instruction in the second dose at Tier 2. One of the things that makes Tier 2 more resource intensive is that we are doing more frequent progress monitoring, getting feedback about whether or not our instruction is working, and being ready to make a change if it's not working. Now, I mentioned the old model where we used to wait for a teacher to make a referral, and then a team would get together to talk about that individual student, send the teacher off with some kind of intervention plan, see how it worked. We don't have to do that anymore in MTSS. We can, as a grade level team, look at screening data and identify where are the holes and gaps for students in this grade level. What system of strategic intervention do we need to apply at Tier 2 for this grade level. We don't have to have a meeting for individual students. We could have a meeting about an individual student, but we can pretty much see what this grade level needs by looking at screening data. So the grade level team can plan tier 2 just like they planned tier 1. We'll know if our tier 2 system of support is effective if it causes something like 15% of students to catch up and reach our grade level expectations. If nobody's catching up with the tier 2 intervention that we're providing, it's not an effective system, and it's not the student's fault. Now, even with effective tier 1 and tier 2, some students, especially students with disabilities, excuse me, may still need more, may still need better instruction. So tier 3 are the most intensive instructional supports, the most individualized supports that we can bring to bear for students. And the goal here is the continual pursuit of outcomes for those students. This is more time, this is more frequent intervention, this is more customized to the needs of individual students, it's more supportive, we are monitoring more frequently. Those are the ways that we intensify between tier 2 and tier 3. It's not necessary to have different interventions or different programs necessarily. You could have the same instructional program at tier 2 and tier 3. What makes it more intensive is more time, more frequent meeting, perhaps daily, smaller group size, more individualized incentives, and so on. The goal here is to find what works, what it takes to enable learning. So through that flexible service delivery, that blending of general education and special education I mentioned earlier, specially designed instruction might be applied to students at tier 3. Special education staff might be involved in delivering small group instruction at tier 3. They could deliver it to students with disabilities, students who are not on IEPs, but this becomes the most intensive support that we can provide to students. And this is the time when it's appropriate to have individual student meetings. This is when we need to really unpack what is specific to this child, to their family and community environment, to their culture. How can we bring all of that to bear for planning for this individual student? So we're doing problem solving at tier 3 around one individual child, and that includes that child's family members and parents. We'll know that we have an effective tier 3 system if that last 5% of students catch up and reach our grade level expectations. Now, I want to talk about the second component that sort of underlies the tiered model, and that is a system of assessments, a school-wide system of assessment. I've talked repeatedly about contextualizing what's in the research to meet the needs of your students, building this tiered system of supports to meet the needs of your students. So how do you know what your students need? Well, you need a series of assessments that are designed for 4 different purposes or questions. You need universal screening tools that answer questions about which students need support, but also which systems need support. It's really helpful to have brief, reliable, and valid indicators of the essential early literacy skills. Those are the important things to screen on. The essential early literacy skills include phonemic awareness, the alphabetic principle and basic phonics, vocabulary and oral language. Oh, I made the balloons go up when I counted to 2. Vocabulary and oral language, text reading fluency, and reading comprehension. Those are what research indicate are essential for reading. That's what we should be screening on. But the most important characteristic of a screener is that it is predictive. We want to know early as possible, in the youngest grade or early in every grade, who might be at risk, and what the magnitude of need is in our grade level. This is the piece people are missing. I think some folks are starting to do a good job of screening to find individuals who are at risk, but we need to be screening to find the systems that are at risk. In addition to universal screening, you'll need diagnostic assessments to go deeper and tell you exactly what to teach tomorrow. So this is a different category of assessment. You'll need different tools for this, and you'll want diagnostic assessments in all 5 of those basic early literacy skill areas. And because we want to make decisions about students in an ongoing way, not with a single test at one point in time, you need progress monitoring. This is the feedback loop to the instructor that tells you if you should keep teaching what and how you're teaching, or if you should make a change to your instruction. Many good universal screening tools have alternate forms that can be used for progress monitoring. Those are the ones you want to rely on. For example, Acadience Reading has those kinds of screening and progress monitoring tools. They also have diagnostic assessments in all 5 of the early literacy areas. Dibble's 8th edition is a newer, different tool that also has screening and progress monitoring measures that are very effective. Direct curriculum-based measures is what you want to look for. And then the 4th purpose is outcome evaluation. Looking back summatively at the end of the year, did students learn what we taught them, what we intended for them to learn? Now, this information needs to be collected and shared with parents on a regular basis. This is regular education information. This isn't something you need special permission to do. These tools help you design a system that meets the needs of all of your students. Now, what are you going to do with all of these data when you have them? That's what you're going to form teams for. Teams at the district, school, grade, and student levels. Parents are members of these teams at all levels. The problem-solving process is a way of using data to answer questions. And the same questions, there are 4 of them, are asked whether we're talking about all first graders in the entire district, or we're talking about a single first grader. So system level questions. So what proportion of our first graders are at risk? Student level questions. Is this student at risk? Our system of assessments helps us to answer each one of these questions. And just like you're probably familiar with doing this kind of thinking process around individuals, I want to encourage you to think about, in the MTSS model, thinking through these steps at the systems level. Is our Tier 1 instruction effective? Do we have effective interventions at Tier 2 and Tier 3? We can use our screening and diagnostic data to answer those questions. And then, just like you might for an individual student have an intervention plan, you will write an intervention plan for your system. Again, this is the piece that I find so many schools are missing. Even if they're starting to do a good job of problem solving and assessment and instruction and intervention for individual students, they might have too many students to make that approach viable. Too many students who are at risk to be able to go one student at a time. So the real power and effectiveness in MTSS is when you are using your assessment data in the problem-solving model in a team to design an intervention for your system. So this is just meant to be a quick example of how that might look. All of this systems change, all of this school improvement takes professional learning and coaching. The school staff, all of the community members are going to need professional development and ongoing coaching on aspects of the reading research, on how to engage in this problem-solving model, on how to give and use assessment data, and on effective instruction. Okay, I'm going to wrap up because it looks like we might have some questions in the chat. I've been ignoring that and just saving for the end. So I want to wrap up by saying that we know too much to be getting the low outcomes that we have been getting for our students. That's just the bottom line. And it's unacceptable. We know too much for so many students to be struggling readers. We know a lot in the reading research about how to prevent reading difficulties and how to intervene with struggling readers. MTSS is the framework for implementing what's known in the reading research. And the most important aspect of MTSS is getting reading instruction right in the regular classroom. It's the fastest way to improve outcomes for all of our students. Kate mentioned some of the places that you can find me online. Here's my website, my email address, social media places that you can find me. And we want to open things up for questions. So I am happy to take a look. Well, I'm going to let you read for me, Kate.
And I think Stephanie, Jen has been we curated some questions before the event that lots of our attendees asked, and we also have some more. So Jen, I'm going to let you throw them out to Stephanie, since you've been tracking, kind of grouping them together. And I just, Stephanie, I want to thank you for this. Every time I hear something from you about MTSS, I learn more and more. And I also want to thank all of the people here tonight, because we have so many educators who are doing this work, joining us to learn more. And I appreciate you taking the time and committing to continuing your journey.
Yeah, it's really impressive. You work all day and then you're going to PD online at night. I mean, you educators are amazing. And you family members, you've been perhaps working all day too.
Parents too. Yes.
Yes, you have been. Yes.
Thank you. Jen, I'll let you take it from here.
Hi. So I have a list of questions for you. I actually was taking notes for myself while you were talking as well. And sorry, there's a couple more coming in at the moment too. So the first question we have, and I'm doing the ones that came into the chat first. Kate, is that okay?
Yes, it is. Sorry,
And
I had a kid hovering
okay.
over top of me.
Do you have the list that came in already? Did you want to do those after these?
Yes, I can do that.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. So the first question that came in was from Anne, and she asked, and I apologize for looking away. I have a second screen that I'm reading from. I don't mean to be rude to everyone. If MTSS is applied and students are still not able to read by third grade, what does that mean? Is the first question she had. She has the second one, but it has a different topic. So I'll let you go with that one first.
Well, so MTSS isn't something that has an end point. The end point is the student outcome. So if a student is a struggling reader in third grade, then we are continuing that problem-solving process. We are intensifying the interventions for the student, the instruction, until we find what works. So finding what works is the outcome, is the result.
Okay, I'm going to go to Jess's question. Jess McKee had a question that sort of follows up that topic, and then we'll go back to Anne's second question. When you were talking about progress monitoring and the frequency of it, you were talking about more frequent. What is the recommended frequency? Every 2 weeks, every week?
Yeah, there's no sort of blanket answer to this question. The purpose of progress monitoring is feedback to the instructor. Should you keep teaching what you've been teaching, or should you make a change? So the sooner you need to know the answer to that, the more frequent you need to monitor progress. If a student is working in a below grade level skill, that's like a sense of urgency, and you should be getting frequent feedback so that you don't keep a student who's struggling that much in an ineffective intervention for very long. You would need that feedback frequently. So that's probably weekly. So a student who's working below grade level, a student for whom you are applying intensive resources, those are students who you need frequent information about so that you can quickly make a change to your instruction. So weekly progress monitoring is probably called for in those situations. It takes like 5 to 7 dots on a graph to be able to see a trend. So that's the practical aspect of it. If you're only collecting data every other week, it's going to be 14 weeks before you can see if what you're doing is working or not. That's like the semester's over and too much time has gone by if it turns out that what you're doing isn't working, right? So those decisions are not based on how the student scored on a screener. They're not based on a composite score. They're not based on red, yellow, green. The decision about frequency of progress monitoring is how soon do you need to know? How urgent is the need of the student?
Yeah, our next question, you were talking about how the ELA block can depend on your data. And you mentioned that sometimes it could need to be shorter or longer. And Anne asked a question, if extra minutes are needed, what areas do you recommend shortening? And some of her suggestions were math, science, related arts. What suggestions do you have?
Yeah, this is a local decision, right? So I can tell you what I've seen, but this is one of the things that the district and building leadership team, which includes family and community members, this is what you come together to make a decision about. So I've seen folks integrate science and social studies into the ELA block. So integrate their science and social studies standards into ELA to create more time. I've seen schools shave 5 minutes off of every class period to create more time for an ELA block. I've seen schools make different decisions at different grade levels, is what I want to say, because it depends on the needs of the students. It's not uncommon for literacy to be prioritized in kindergarten and first grade. And it's a much more difficult endeavor when you get into third grade and above to make those tough decisions. It's not easy, but if you don't prioritize the time, you're just going to keep getting the same results. So again, this is why a team that represents all aspects of your school community needs to come together and make these difficult decisions.
And our next question is from Amber. In Tier 2 support, is there a definition of a small group and how it is enforced?
Well, I don't know what enforced means, but a definition of a small group. In Tier 2, I would think 3 to 5 students. I think when you get above 5 students, it's difficult to target instruction to students. It's difficult to give each one sufficient practice. It's difficult to give each student adequate corrective feedback. So something between 3 and 5 students. The research is mixed as far as the benefits of one-on-one instruction. I think that's kind of good news that it doesn't necessarily have to be one-on-one. Groups of 2 or 3 or 4 can be effective. Something like 3 to 5 for intervention, I would suggest. And then the enforced, I don't know about that. You'll have to follow up on that because I'm not sure what that means.
We have one more from the live questions, and then I'm going to move over into the submitted questions. Our next question is from Jen, and not me, Jen, the other Jen. Is literacy instruction the origin of the MTSS academic model? You mentioned how it was originally a medical model.
Yeah, so it was applied to behavior support first. So the idea of a tiered approach, the application of the public health, primary, secondary, tertiary prevention was first applied to behavior supports, what you might now know as PBIS. So that was the first sort of transfer from public health into a school environment. Rob Horner and George Sagai pioneered a lot of that work to implement a tiered approach to behavioral support. And then the next iteration was for reading, elementary reading. And folks are now exploring what that looks like for math, what that looks like for secondary academic supports, and so on. But we have most research on MTSS as it's applied to behavior or to primary or elementary grade reading.
Okay, I have a clarification on enforced.
Thank you.
Enforced meaning if a district is doing small group with 10 kids, what could be done? This isn't a small group per year suggested 3 to 5 kids. I feel like you're not alone in this, Amber.
Yeah, so there are practical constraints within schools, right? And sometimes you have to do the best you can with what you have. That's just the reality. But people have to be thoughtful about that. And the decisions need to be based on the needs of the students and not on the preferences of the adults. Okay, so with that said, it's not impossible that you might get excellent outcomes for students in a group of 10. But if you are not catching students up, if nobody in that group of 10 is growing and closing the gap and catching up to grade level expectations, then you need to rethink that. You might need to change group size. That's one of the variables that might need to change, but it might be something else. You might not be teaching in an effective way to those 10 students. So that perhaps would be the first thing to change. You might have a group of 10 who all have different needs. Some of them need support with reading comprehension. Some need support with phonemic awareness. Like that's not a targeted group. So there are a couple of variables that can be changed if your quote unquote small group instruction isn't effective, and group size is just one of those variables.
And Jen, I'm going to piggyback onto this question and what Dr. Stollar just said with one of our submitted questions, because I think sometimes those big groups that we see in MTSS can result because of what this question asks. So it says, how do you navigate a tier 1 issue that has resulted in a significant number of students lacking literacy proficiency? The long-term effects are low literacy rates, and it seems like an insurmountable problem.
So attending to tier 1 is the way that you counteract that, right? Like what I so often see is universal screening and then sending students to intervention with no conversation, no attention, no consideration of what's going on in classroom reading instruction in tier 1. And in some schools I've worked in, more students are leaving the classroom to get intervention than are staying back in the classroom. So the first thing is to make sure that tier 1 is lined up to what the students need. And that might include differentiating the tier 1 instruction, particularly in the word recognition skills, phonemic awareness, phonics and spelling, text reading fluency, and reading comprehension. If you have a wide range of student performance within a grade level, it might not make sense to do any whole group word recognition instruction. It might only make sense, because everybody's at a different place in word recognition skills, to do differentiated small group word recognition instruction. So that's where that flexible service delivery comes into play. That's where this responsibility of differentiating is not put only on the classroom teacher, but students are shared across the grade level, and all available resources are coming to bear to support that differentiation. special education staff, so teachers, paraprofessionals, any other remedial reading staff, title teachers, EL staff, SLPs, school psychs, counselors, social workers, principals, librarians, whoever you have available, can flood the grade level to get that differentiated first reading instruction. Some students who are the lowest performing are going to need that extra dose at another time of day at tier 2 or tier 3. So their learning opportunities are getting stacked on top of each other. That's the triangle image. Students who are behind, students who are at risk, get more minutes targeted at their skill level every day. That's what accelerates their learning and catches them up. And if you organize those systems for tier 1 instruction in kindergarten and first grade, you can realize that opportunity of prevention. Everybody leaves first grade a reader.
Okay, thank you.
It gets harder and harder to do, not impossible, but harder and harder to do as you go up in the grades.
And I would assume harder and harder to do, it's very hard when you're transitioning. So when the ineffective system, when you're going in and fixing it, it must be very hard at the beginning.
Yes, and this is why you need collaborative teams with a problem-solving structure to keep everybody focused and guided by the data, so that you're supporting each other, so that you have a clear mission, a clear objective, everybody's moving in the same direction, and that you are together surfacing these things. Like I said, if you wave your magic wand, you're surfacing what needs to change about your system. You're prioritizing that list. You're systematically developing a plan for the first priority on your list, that action plan for the system. That's how you manage the complexity of the change that you're pointing out, Kate, because it can seem overwhelming. You don't have to do it in every grade at once. You don't have to do it in every building at once. You can get some traction and momentum by trying this at a smaller scale, perhaps with the grade level where the teachers are most ready and interested in trying something different, or the school that has perhaps the most enthusiastic and willing leader. Get some traction, demonstrate some success, and then spread that to a larger scale.
Okay, thank you. And training. Can you talk just a little bit about training and who should be trained? And I know you touched on it in your presentation, but I think this sometimes gets missed when we start the work.
Yeah. So I'm just listing the big chunks of what folks need to get training on, right? Like each one of these bullets is a big area. So this is not just we like this speaker and so we're going to bring them in for a day. This is like a coordinated and well thought out plan across years. A lot of thought needs to go into this. Who's getting what information and when, so that this is an ongoing learning experience that's supported with coaching, either formal or informal, and that people are getting the opportunity to apply what they're learning to their daily work. Somebody mentioned letters training right before we started, which is a fantastic learning opportunity for this first bullet. But if you don't have the coaching to apply that new learning to your curriculum, to your system of supports, to the grade level that you work in, to the students that you're working with, sometimes it doesn't really stick. So this cannot be overstated, how important this consistent plan about professional learning is. And it's not just for the educators. You know, even if we just talk about the science of reading, you know, you think about your school community is a system. And if you make a change in one part of that system, it ripples out into all the other factors. So one example that I hear frequently is within the school community, they're making changes to the way that they teach high frequency irregular words. but nobody has clued in the families that there's a change in this way. So the parents are like, where's my list of sight words? You know, used to send this home every week and now I'm not seeing it anymore. And so it creates this like conflict that could easily be avoided. So this learning, this ongoing development applies to all members of the school community.
Great, thank you. Jen, do we have more? I'm like,
I just wanted to, so the question that you brought up, we can kind of tie a few more of the questions that were submitted together. And also, I wanted to add additional clarity because I know that a lot of us that are teachers now or students, we learned through the reading groups. I was a red bird or a blue bird, and it was sort of a form of tracking, for lack of a better term. And the way that you're describing this support through flooding a grade level, that isn't what we're talking about, right?
Yes, very good clarification. I typically use the word flexible, skill-based small groups to correct for this misunderstanding that yes, the grouping is flexible across time. The idea is to accelerate learning and catch students up. So you have to monitor progress frequently so that you know when students are ready to move to the next skill, if they're ready to be regrouped, if the groups should shuffle, so that ongoing data collection and progress monitoring informs those decisions. It's just for the ELA block. It doesn't apply across the whole school day, and you're not in the same group all year necessarily. I mean, it could be the case, but not necessarily. Yeah, so thank you for bringing that up.
And to follow that, somebody had said you would recommend flooding a grade level as opposed to a classroom.
Yes.
I guess depending on your data. I mean, if one classroom had particular identified need all at once, which the odds of that would be rare, but they also, to add on to that, someone said utilizing staff, and I think you covered this, general ed teachers, title staff, special ed, paras. We could do like a walk to read, I think is what a lot of people refer to that as, where you would just find spaces available and send your students to those spaces with a professional to work with.
That's right.
That
That's right. What
Okay.
many people are calling a walk to read approach or win time, what I need time, that differentiation. However, most people are conceptualizing that as an intervention model as tier 2. And what that means is they're doing business as usual, maybe a whole group for 90 to 120 minutes, and expecting this little itty bitty 30-minute walk to read time to catch kids up. You're spending 90 to 120 minutes, in some cases, teaching over the heads of students and expecting 30 minutes of intervention to catch them up. And then you're wondering why they don't catch up. And then you're saying, well, they're not learning with tier 2 intervention. We're going to move them to tier 3 or suspected disability and refer for an evaluation. Oh, no, no, that doesn't work. That you have set up a system that is designed for failure. That's not going to work. So what I'm suggesting is that walk to read model is happening in tier 1. That we're not wasting an instructional minute. We're not spending time on skills that students already know or expecting them to do something that's many steps down the scope and sequence from where they are currently. We're using every instructional minute targeted to where their skill level is so that the instruction will be effective quickly. So effective and efficient so that they quickly move through that scope and sequence and get caught up.
And then a follow-up to that would be, how soon should you start looking at your data to begin your MTSS model? For example, when you're looking at your kindergarten class that's coming in, a lot of times teachers will say, well, we have a lack of experience here. Should exposure and experience to preschool or the world in general be a considerable factor when you're looking at if a student needs support from, additional tier 2 or what have you, or should you just begin supporting them as soon as possible?
Yeah, so I hear this often. We shouldn't even screen in kindergarten until the middle of the year because they haven't been exposed to school, or we shouldn't, we should wait to do intervention or whatever until they've been in school for a couple of weeks. And I think that's missing the point. Again, the screening is not for intervention for individuals. The screening is to identify the needs of the student body in that grade level so that you design instruction, first reading instruction in the regular classroom, tier 1, to meet those needs. So I want to screen on about the 3rd day of kindergarten so that I can act immediately on that information, not by sending the child out for intervention, but by designing the classroom reading instruction that's customized to those students' needs. And I don't even need to wait for screening at the beginning of 1st grade and beyond, because I can plan for day 1 of 1st grade, 2nd grade, 3rd grade, 5th grade, based on last year's end of year screening data. Assuming you don't have a completely transient population, you pretty much know what kids are going to start the school year with. And so you should hit the ground running day 1, customizing tier 1 to the needs of the students. It's a different way of thinking.
It's definitely a big mindset shift and so many different topics that have asked. And there's one more from a parent that I definitely wanted to ask. A parent had asked, what do you suggest parents do if they know their district is not effectively implementing an MTSS model? And I'm sure you get this question often if you're doing something for parents. If the district is not collecting data, for example, using a universal screener, they're not providing any intervention or appropriate intervention to support students. This is essentially causing students to fall further behind. What do you suggest to parents who are such an important stakeholder?
I would have a hard time knowing what state isn't requiring some form of universal screening at this point.
Pennsylvania would be one.
Pennsylvania. Yeah.
You have no
No.
literacy screening.
No.
No, we're working on that
And
right
we
now.
and
but
we
do
also
not.
use the discrepancy model in the majority of school districts. Those who use RTI, it's a choice, have to be approved, and they have to go through audits from Patent or PDE. So most districts do not choose to use the RTI model. Yeah, so
Yes.
it is, Stephanie, it's a complex, like, it is kind of like the dark ages a little bit, because you are sitting in meetings where you have schools really trying to implement MTSS, and we have an amazing system that we can access through Patent, where we have to, not everyone knows about it. And if you're in a school, there is a really strong system that you can sign up for coaching and audits and all sorts of things. And you can reach out to us if you have a question about how to do that. But the schools are doing it on their own, and then there's the special ed process that doesn't connect, and it is very it can be difficult.
So you do have 3rd grade accountability assessments. Have you done away with that?
Well, we have state testing, but we don't have a 3rd grade requirement for proficiency.
But you know the proportion of your 3rd graders who have passed your state assessment. So I would start there, I guess. I would use that data point as a conversation starter with whoever your point of contact, whoever you want to start with in your school, a teacher, a principal, a board member, a district office administrator, whoever, makes sense for you to start with. And I would start the conversation with that data point. And then I would be, perhaps I'm assuming, talking about your own child's outcomes and looking for information about your own child's data. So I would work it from both directions, I think, as a parent, advocating for your own child, but talking about your child in the greater context of the outcomes for the entire district of third graders. And I'd be looking for teachers who are in that system who seem to be also interested in seeing a change happen. Finding just that one person within the system that you can link arms with to open up those conversations. And not going in with, trying to force changes initially, but opening up the lines of communication and conversation. And there's so many ways to do that these days. So many podcasts, so many webinars, so many videos that can be conversation starters about reading outcomes. I'd be looking for the really positive, turnaround. I've seen plenty of these from Pennsylvania where people have changed the way that they do business and they've gotten different outcomes for students. I'd be sharing the news about those stories. So those are some ideas about where to start.
And I would suggest that if you have data for your child and the district is taking data, that you politely ask them to share the data. Because I think that is one thing that we run into is that in systems where the authentic transformation is happening, data is, even if the data isn't good, it's a comfortable conversation that teams can have. And when it's not being shared with board members and the community, and it seems like it's something that's hard to access, that's when, it's not, you can infer that the system isn't quite taking shape the way it should be. So
Yeah.
it's a way parents and families can organically push for some change that's not too disruptive or offensive.
Yeah.
And you don't, teachers can, and those of you who are classroom educators, sometimes they can't give it to you. So it's easier to go to, it can be easier to go to the leader, and politely ask for it. And you have access to, also, like Stephanie said, all sorts of webinars and ways to like politely push information that doesn't make it sound like you're the expert. Or trying to be as a community member or a parent.
Yeah, see, you should go to Kate. Would be my
Well,
recommendation.
But when
You
I
should go
say
to other
that,
parents.
yeah, when I say that, we do spend time a lot in meetings trying to do this, and that's why we exist.
Yeah,
We
exactly.
were not some of us who started Everyone Reads PA were not able to effectively do it in our own school district. So, and some school districts have less incentive to make these changes because they're more successful from the outside. So, but I think Stephanie and I are early risers and early we go to bed early. So I want to make sure we're respectful of this time that she's given to us so generously. And again, want to thank everyone for attending. We will send a link to this to our mailing list and any attendees. And we ask you to share it with your teams, your friends, your colleagues, because our mission is just to make sure that as many people get this information as possible. And I thank you all for coming, and thank you so much, Stephanie.
It's my pleasure. And if I didn't get your question, please send it to me by email. Thank you all for being here, and thanks for inviting me, Kate.
Yep, no problem. Thanks, everybody. Have a great spring break. Thanks so much.